I'm going to go over assembling this short block, which is my new engine for my Time Attack Cutlass. It's a 350 Oldsmobile diesel block. We're using the stock diesel crank. It's been cut down to small block Chevy rods. We got custom pistons for it. We're just going to be going over basic long block assembly. I mean, the block's been fully machined now. And just going to go over some of the basics and things to look out for, things to check while you're putting a short block together. Now this is going to be a dry sump motor, so I have this suction tube that I fabricated to pull oil from the valley area. I have plugged most of the drain backs. As you can see here, I've plugged most of the drain backs and just did one hole at the very front and left the one at the very back in order to drain when the engine is not running. However, when it is running, this is all going to be filling in with oil from all these lifters. They'll be oozing oil out, plus it'll be returning from the heads on either end. And this is just another, so it'll build up oil in here, and then this will be a third return back to the dry sump pump. The first thing we're going to start with is putting the cam in, and then the crankshaft, but before I get to that point, I need to clean up the block a little bit here, as has been sitting for several months. It does have the main bearings in it already because I was checking bearing clearances. The cam bearings are already installed. So I'll need to be taking the main caps loose and off. That'll give me better access for being able to get in there and help the cam along to get that in. We'll pull the bearings out, wipe everything down again, and then start prepping to put in the crank. As you can see, this block has been fully machined. It's been cleaned, line honed, cam bearings put in. It's been clearanced for a double roller timing set. This plug is to block off the oil hole for where the injection pump for the diesel would have been. This is a 350D, so it's got the 842 lifter bores on it. It's been decked, it's been bored, and I mean, like right now you can see I got paint overspray and stuff in there. That's actually not a big deal at this point because we'll be wiping out the cylinders here in a minute, and the decks will get brake clean before the head gaskets go on. Right now I'm just concerned about trying to make sure I get rid of anything that's going to be loose or possibly plugging any holes. Before the cam bearings were put in, this block was final clean, so it had all the oil galleys scrubbed out. That's a very important part. You don't want any bit of debris left in anywhere that it can be in the oiling system or get loose in the engine, because the #1 killer of a fresh engine is dirt and debris that just doesn't get cleaned out during the final assembly process. One of the big ones for that is going to be these cylinder walls. That's why I'm not worried about the overspray right now. We'll be wiping that out, and I'll show you just exactly how much stuff actually comes out of there when that happens. I've kept all my bearings and caps in line. You can see some minor, well, if the camera will focus here. I don't know, I got some minor little rub marks that you can see across the bearings. That is from the bore gauge. And these are the main sizes that I measured on the crank with the micrometer, and then I use that same micrometer to set up my bore gauge. That way I could know exactly what the oil clearance is for the rods and the mains. Not only is it just about checking it up and down, but the best way that I've found is to do at an angle about like this and like this, average those two, and then average that against an up and down. And the reason for this is bearings are actually egg-shaped to start with. They have a little more clearance on the sides because, especially in a rod bearing, when you have the stresses of it going up and down in an engine, it will actually stretch up and down and pull the sides in. And that clearance change is actually factored in the manufacture of the bearings. And that's something that I try to factor in when I'm measuring it. I don't want to go full to the parting line on stuff because it's obviously going to be way huge there. But going to about like a 45 and a 45, averaging those two to get a number, and then taking the vertical and averaging against that, you get a pretty good number for what the actual oil bearing clearance is. And I've done that this way with the bore gauges versus, say, plastic gauge, is because plastic gauge, while it's better than nothing, still has a window of error. Building engines, I would try to be a lot more accurate than that, especially in this case. Like, I've had to originally checked with some standards and came up with bearing clearances that were just way too loose, and I actually ended up with ones in this engine to tighten them up. And that's something that I may or may not have seen with plastic gauge, and I sure as hell wouldn't have seen it if I didn't check at all, and I'd have probably had problems with oil pressure and banging out the rod bearings because it's just way too big of a gap if I hadn't bothered checking. Now, for wiping down the bearing surfaces and the cylinders to clean out any overspray and crap from machining, I'm going to start with a white cloth. Some of the blue auto parts store towels work good as well. Just going to use some ATF. You can also use Marvel Mist Oil or something similar, but as far as for a cheap option there, ATF works just fine. Going to want to let it soak into the rag some before you start wiping down surfaces. We want to get all the machine surfaces and the mating surfaces. You don't have to worry about too much oil on it. We'll go back over it with another rag after the fact. And already there, this block has been cleaned before, and we already got that much coming out of just the mains. So now we'll go into the cylinders. You want to make sure you're wiping all the way around and top to bottom, get every bit of surface there. And that's just one cylinder. All that dirt is not good if you're putting together a brand new engine, because all that crap's immediately going to be filling up your oil filter, or worse yet, it's small enough it's getting past. So, we're going to wipe down all the cylinders, and then I'll probably flip the rag, reapply, and wipe them down again. And typically I'll do about 2 cylinders at a time. I can flip the rag, get a fresh surface, and then keep going. Can flip to some fresh surfaces, or you can have some cleaner options. We'll reapply some more fluid and keep going. And now that was the second pass of all 8 cylinders. So we'll get one more clean rag right from start, and then we'll go through all for a third time, and we should be able to have everything out. You should also notice that the tranny fluid not only lifts out any dirt that's in there, but what it's also doing is it's dissolving the paint overspray, so we're getting rid of that, and it's providing some lubrication to the cylinder, so that when we do start putting our pistons and stuff in, we don't have to worry about a dry cylinder. It's already got lubrication. We'll be adding more oil and stuff to like the ring pack and the skirts of the pistons, but we don't have to worry about having the cylinder completely dry on startup. Another crucial thing is just wanting to double check that our bearings are all in the right place and that we do have oil galleys open and clean. Now, normally on an Oldsmobile you'd be able to shine the light through the top and be able to see a dot where it was underneath, but I have grooved back cam bearings, so I was able to index them and get the oil hole over here on the bearing. And I can just glance down through each hole and see that I can see that oil groove and know that I will have oil supply to the cam. Now I have had to do a little bit of additional wipe down cleaning. Normally you wouldn't have to worry about the lifter bores after a block has been final cleaned, but if you can kind of see it there, I have plugs inside the lifter bores there. Now they're drilled with a 40 thousandths hole, and this is to restrict the oil going to the top end because I will be running solid roller lifters and a full roller set up on the heads, so I can decrease the amount of oil that's required up top, and that's a good way to do it. I had to do that afterwards, so that was the reason for the extra wipe down, to make sure that I got any grit out of there. So I could get, as you can see, the overspray is gone out of the cylinders. They're all nice, clean, ready for assembly. Now that I have everything cleaned up, ready to pop the bearings back in to the same place that I took them out of from when checking clearances, then I'll be able to get the rear main seal half set in place. We'll offset that some so that the parting line isn't exactly at the same parting line as the block, so it'll be offset some so we can split any kind of oil seepage that's possible, but we will be using silicone on the ends just to seal that up. The other thing is, because this is a dry sump motor, I will be flipping the seal over and installing it facing the opposite direction. Normally the seal lip, be like this so that I can catch pressure underneath the lip and push it up to seal the crank. Normally that would be facing in to the block so that I can catch pressure on the inside block and push up against the crank to seal. However, with the dry sump application, because we'll be pulling vacuum in the block compared to atmospheric pressure, we'll flip that around so that the atmospheric pressure will actually push on it and seal it to the crank. Now for the rear main seal on an Olds, we're using, since this is a diesel block, it's the same, it's a 3-inch main, so it's the same as a big block Olds. So we're using a BS 4065-4. This is actually for a Ford 460, and the sizes are super close. It's no problem to use them on an Oldsmobile. For, like I said, a diesel or a big block, the Ford Y block, like the flathead stuff, I believe that's a Y block. Anyway, that rear main seal, when you can get a good style one that's not a rope seal or whatever, those fit the small block Oldsmobiles. For the silicone I'll be using on them, I just got some of this basic Velcro black stuff. It really doesn't matter as long as it's an engine silicone that can handle the temperature. We're not going to use a ton of it. We're just using it just a dab, so it doesn't take much. This thing will be way more than enough. There, all we need is a dab out of it, and this is a fresh tube I have that's going to have good silicone in it. Now, when we go to install this in the block, I'm going to have my seal lip facing out, and when it goes in the block, I'll put it in with an offset, maybe not quite this much, but I'll go in with a bit of an offset like that, and then the rear main cap will have the reciprocating end offset as well, and that's just so that we get this area right on the ends where we got to dab a little bit of silicone offset from the actual block crease as well. So I'm putting a little bit of silicone on here. I typically just run a little bit along the back side. Hopefully this is coming out on camera. Let's see here. Yeah, that'll help. I'm just trying to put a little bit all the way around, and honestly I don't have to get it perfect because there's way too much right there, and I can just take this and I can just put a little smear on it, and now we got even silicone all the way around. Again, not supposed to be required, however, it's just a little bit of a safety precaution. Now, if this was going to sit for a long time, I'd be using assembly lube, but I'm just going to use regular leftover oil from doing oil changes and stuff, because I will definitely be priming the heck out of this engine before firing it up. So we're just going to get some oil on it. You don't want any dry surfaces where there's going to be bearing material or the crank touching. Want to make sure you get the thrust surface as well. Because even if you put these together dry and you start cranking it over just for even putting the pistons in, you can rub the top layer of Babbitt off the bearings. So, just gotta get some lube on there. Now I want to get the camshaft put in. I've already taken it out of its bag. However, it's got all this sticky anti-rust, whatever you want to call it, lube on there. So before we put assembly lube on it, which should be just a regular cam and lifter lube, I want to use some brake clean and take all this old residue off of here, just because I don't know what it is. It might break down in oil, it might not. You're better if the choice is clean or try to let it go, always clean it. I want to be sure to wipe it down every lobe and all the journals. And there's only so much you can do with the distributor gear, but try your best. Now this cam has been cut, and that's so that can run a thrust roller bearing on the front of the block. At the time when I got this cam, I was having problems keeping the thrust alive on my other engine. I have since figured that out, but this is still just a nice upgrade. I don't have to worry about the cam wearing into the block. This will hold it from going towards the block and not wearing because it's a roller bearing surface, and then I'll be making a thrust button for the front so that we can make sure that it's not trying to push its way out the front of the block. Now this is the part that gets pretty messy with the cam lube, and it's just kind of get stuff on there and then get it ready to stick in the block. I'm going to start out with putting a little bit on my finger and rub it around the block first, just so that I, like the mains, want to make sure that we're getting some lube on there to start with. Alright, and now just kind of the way of it here, it's kind of easiest just to start rubbing it on, get your whole hand in there. Can just squeeze it as I go. Like I said, this is the part that just gets messy, but it's easy to make sure that you get everything covered up with lube. Oh, I'm getting it all over my bar. Alright, now we want to put some on the bearing as well. Now the size of this happens to fit into the cut on the block to locate it. So that tells me that this side goes to the block and this side will go to the cam. So I can get that slipped on just like that. Now I'm going to flip it over and try to get this started into the block. Let's see if we can turn the camera. You want to be really careful about putting it in. You don't want to be scuffing up the bearings any more than inevitable. Once you get to a certain point, it gets really hard to get any leverage on there. That's where an install tool, or in my case I just have a bolt, can stick it in the end of the camshaft like that and then just help you assist in having some leverage to put it in the rest of the way. So I'm kind of pushing down, I'm using my fingers as a pivot point so I can work it in. You get to this point and it gets pretty difficult, but you just got to go easy with it. Like I said, you don't want to be scuffing up the bearings any more than you have to be. And there we go. The cam is home. I can turn it by hand, that's good. It means I don't have any binding anywhere, whether it be a misalignment in the block of the cam bearings or if the cam bearings are the wrong size. So it's a good first step. Alright, now that I'm ready to set the crankshaft in, I'm going to get it out of the box. Much like the camshaft, it's going to have oily residues and such on the crank. So we're going to want to wipe all that off with brake cleaner as well. Again, this is another thing where a blue towel works nice, or you just have to have something to wipe it down with. Brake cleaner, get it good and wet, and just go around the journals. I can see it getting a little bit of dirt off of there, so I'll just flip it inside out around halfway and just keep trying to keep a fresh, clean area on the journal. Alright, and this crank has been ground, it's been cleaned, the holes have all been scrubbed out prior to this. This is just the last little bit of cleaning before it actually goes in the engine block. Another thing you don't want to forget is putting a little lube on the rear main seal. So we got that first half of the seal in there. We're just going to take a little dab of the oil and I'm just going to lube it up on that lip. We don't need so much that we're getting the ends of the seal covered in oil, because we are going to want to put a little dab of silicone on there when we get to that point. But we want to make sure that we're not going to be starting the engine with that seal dry. And just carefully set the crank in. Just like that. Get a little wiggle, just I can feel how smooth it is, everything's sitting in there nice and square. Now I'll usually start with the center main cap on the Olds because that's the thrust. If it was a small block Chevy, it'd start with the rear. And depending on what engine you're working with there, they're different ones. For the thrust, same thing. We're going to get some oil on this. Wipe down the surfaces, make sure we got nothing that's going to be dry. Tang goes to tang. Gotta follow my own advice. I have the studs out because it's much easier to get the cap started with them out. Shouldn't have to do any more than a light tap in. It is a press fit. Now I'm just going to run these studs in. They do have ARP assembly lube on them from when they were getting machined. For the base threads, I'm not going to Loctite them in there, and I'm just running them. And I'm just running them down till it gets tension to be tight. You don't want to torque them into the block. You just want to get them to where they're snug. We'll be removing these ones afterwards now, and then we'll be reapplying lube before torquing up the mains. Now, with the rear main, I'm going to want to take care of that seal. Again, back to just a little bit of silicone along the back side. Will do ya. And you can see that, I mean, that's how much excess came off. I mean, just bare minimum required, people. And now also, it's going to need to be offset that way, tilted. So I'm going to transfer that into the cap. It helps if I lay the cap the correct way. So, cap's going to be like this. I need to decant it a little bit. And we get it set in there. Now, because I have a little bit sticking out, We're going to take our silicone and we're just going to put just a dab on the end of both sides. That's all you need. Excess silicone is very bad for an engine. Maybe I didn't mention before, but you want to make sure that all your surfaces are very clean when you're putting these caps together. You can also see that this main cap has these two little grooves here. You're also going to want to put a little silicone across those, because that can be a leak to the outside of the block, considering the oil pan gasket sits right there. So here we'll use just enough to fill that up. And then we're going to put a little on the surface itself. Behind there. Smear it. This way we get it, and then try to get down around the seals on both sides. This is just so that we can make sure we don't have a little seep of oil on the back. Not that I will with this engine, because dry sump, if anything, will be leaking in. But good practices all around. I almost forgot to lube up that seal. So we want to make sure we get oil on that. Lip surface. There we go. And then we just need to carefully get this seal started in each side of the groove, and the cap should drop right on. Almost push it down by hand. I got a little press fit. There it is. It's home. These studs don't actually get all the way tight, and that's fine. I mean, as far as into the block, we just want to make sure we got full thread engagement up on top of the nut, because they're still going to have plenty in the block. That cap still isn't quite sitting down. There we go. Now I'm going to want to undo all the nuts. And we're going to apply some fresh ARP lube to the threads. Before we go through our torque sequence. With your ARP lube, you want to make sure that you're getting a good coating on the threads, so that when you run the nuts back on there, it's pretty much throughout the entire thread engagement of the nut, or you can throw them on the floor. You don't have to have it like avalanche overflow out of everything, but you want to make sure that you have plenty on there. And if you're wondering why not using washers, it's kind of a give or take. I mean, the washers are not absolutely required. A lot of times you'll have them, especially with bolts. And in the case of a bolt, you definitely want to run them, because they typically are a little bit bigger than even the wide part of the head on the studs there. They're about the same size, so you're not really gaining any surface area. And you can build engines with them, without them. It doesn't seem to make much of a difference, if at all. especially on the mains. So now that we got all those down, I'm going to come back and I'm just going to snug my thrust cap ever so slightly. I mean, there's not a ton of pressure on that. And we're going to get out the hammer and we're going to make sure that we first hit it to the back. Square on the crank. What we're trying to do is we're trying to square up those thrust surfaces, and then we'll go back to the front because that's the way the transmission will be pushing. And then we're going to want to torque this one up and we'll check our thrust clearance. So I have this magnetic dial indicator. I got a Scott magnetic base onto the front of the block here. We're indicating off the front of the crank. Right now it's still as we hit it from the back. I have it set to 0 and we're just going to put a little pry bar pressure against the counterweights and the block, and we're going to see how much it moves here. It's not always easy to find the best place to pry from, but so it looks like at this point in time we have just shy of 6 thou there, and we'll go back the other way and we have 1 thou to the other side. So that means we have a crank thrust of 7 thousandths, which is good. That's right where we want to be. Pretty much any engine anywhere from 3 to 8 is a good place to be. Now we've checked the thrust clearance, we can just go through the torque sequence on the rest of the main caps. Typically going to do it in 3 steps. Usually you can divide that into roughly 3 even steps. And that'll all depend on what engine you're working with. I'm just going to run these down a little bit further because I did pull the cap down some more and I want to get maximum thread engagement. This is being kind of nitpicky, but hey, there's thread engagement there to be had, might as well use it. I always go through them a second time, just to absolutely make sure. You never know when you might have a little bit of a brain fart and forget one or miss it. So, alright, let's crankshaft in. So another part before we can get the pistons put in is getting the rings fit. These can either come as a to bore size, or you can get file fits that are 5. I wanted to get ones that fit correctly, but looks like I ended up with some file fit 5s, so we're going to go making them fit. Normally there's a proper tool for being able to set it up and then grind just a little bit softly off of it, and then you can go back and forth checking it in the cylinder. Since I don't have that and I'm pretty steady with my hand, I'll just be going like this and just come in and just real softly touching the edge. The most important part is to try to keep it square so that when you push the rings together you still got a nice square edge on there. You don't want to be getting a big angle on it or anything like that, because that can just end up with leaking some exhaust gases, or worse yet, you think you got a good gap and it's tight on one spot and then you lock up a ring. I'm not too worried about being like perfect on this because a lot of your ring specs are minimum, so going a couple of thou over is just fine. I've already done most of them. This is just the last one to finish up, and pretty much all the ring gaps are within a 5 thousandths window. Some people might think that that's, oh my gosh, it's super bad. It's not. The ring doesn't care. Once the engine's running, it will not care. And if anything, you're better off with a little bit wide than the minimum gap, just because then if the engine gets extra hot and overheats, or you try to run it hard when it hasn't fully warmed up there, you got a little bit of safety measure before you actually lock up a ring. So this one's uncut. I know that if I stick it in the bore, that it has just ever so slight of a gap, definitely nowhere near where we need to be, so we're going to give it a rough in. Now with that, I was using very light pressure. I went, instead of grinding on the outside of the wheel, I moved it farther in so that it would actually grind a little bit slower. The big thing we're looking for here, I don't know if you're going to be able to see it or not, is going to be that when these push together, they sit nice and flush. Also, because we're grinding, it's got a bit of a burr on there, so we'll file that off. We also want to get the face of it. The face being the side that hits the cylinder wall. Top and bottom, just knock the corners off the back. Basically, we don't want any sharp edges that'll be gouging the cylinder wall at all. Now with it deburred, we'll come in, I'll push it just to start it into the cylinder. Normally there's a ring squaring tool that you can use for this. However, if you don't have that, and you've already checked to make sure your oil ring rails have the minimum of a 15 thousandths gap on them, you can actually put it on a piston, and as long as you got a mostly square top, you ain't got a dome that goes way over the edge. Here I've got a little bit of a dome on here, but it covers most of the piston. So to actually come in and just use that oil ring as a stop to square the piston, it works quite well. Then we can come in with a feeler gauge and check and see what we have for gap. Now the minimum that I have spec'd out as far as JE's recommendations on here are about 24 to 25 thousandths right there. I mean, I'm putting just light pressure on to push it in between the ring and make sure that it goes all the way up against the cylinder wall. Right now I have 21. So since I only have a couple of thou left to go, rather than grinding and being too aggressive with that, I'll just file the rest of it. Now for doing this, I'm going to want to try my best to lay the file down on there, keep it square, and then be in a position where I can make sure that I'm going to file that as square as possible. For me, it helps to square up against my chest with one hand. I get it eyeballed square to start with, and then I'll only be moving my other hand as best as possible. And again, just knock the corners off to deburr that. We don't want to be scratching the cylinder wall at all, and we don't want to forget to do it. Then I can push it together, check that I got a nice square butt up. And we'll check it again. Now there we've only moved to 23, so that was about 2 thou that I took off with that. 25 I'm acting as my minimum, but most of the other ones there, I'm going to put about 26, 28, so we want to take at least another 3 off of this. Oh, 25 drops right in. The 26. And it's snug with the 28. So I'd say that I'm probably around a 27. That's good. It matches up with all the rest of them. And now that the rings are file fit, they're file fit to each bore that they will go in. So now as I come around, I'm going to pull my pistons, get those laid out. I'll decide which cylinder they're going to go into, and then I'll be installing the rings on each piston based on that cylinder that it's going to go into, and then we'll start putting the pistons and rods in. Now I'm ready to put the rings on the first piston I'm going to put in, which I'm going to start with number 1. And I need to find a piston that matches up with that. As far as the valve pocket layout. So this, with the intake to the front of the block, this matches up with the release to the valley side with being a piston that can either go in number 1 or number 3. Or if it was flipped around the other way, installed by that I mean installed on the other side of the block, it could be a 8 or a 6. We're going to put it in cylinder number 1. So we're going to start with putting the rings on. I'll pull the rings out of cylinder number 1, since that's the cylinder we're going to put it in. The way I pulled them out is top ring, second ring. The other way to verify that is some rings will have a dot indicating up. Let me fix the plate here. Maybe that'll help with being able to see. So some rings are going to have a dot indicating up. I don't know if you can see it, but right there, there's a little dot. The other way that I know this is a second ring, other than that being the dot facing up, is that I know the downward side is going to have this chamfer on the inner edge. By comparison, a top ring will have the dot to the upside and the chamfer on the upper side. So they are opposite that way. Usually there'll be some material, piece of paper, whatever, with your ring set that will tell you that kind of stuff, or how to identify it if it is not indicated by a dot. Now typically you're going to want to put the rings on so that the gaps are opposite of each other. It really doesn't matter which way they go, we're just going to turn one way and one the other way. I prefer to do this kind of stuff sitting in a chair, something where I can support my feet if I need to. They do make tools for this, however you don't always have a tool. So I'm going to have the piston where it's supported by my legs and knees, and I'm going to just get the gap edge started, or lined up rather, with the second ring groove, and then I'm just going to push out and expand the ring until it slips over just like that. And then I can turn it to this side. Again, make sure you're putting it on with the dot up. You can always just verify that. Yep. And then I'll do the same with the top ring. Got the dot facing me, chamfer up, line it up with that groove, and then just start spreading it. And basically what I'm doing is I'm pushing on one side of it and I'm feeding it down with the other side, and it'll snap right on just like that. I can turn it to 90 degrees, or parallel with the crank if you will, on both of them, but on opposite sides. Now we have the rings positioned where we can minimize bleed down. This is typically just a way to do it when installing them. I don't know how much factor it really has on the engine running, because in a perfect world there, the rings are able to spin and rotate freely and they're not going to be locked into position in any way, shape, or form, because that would be causing wear of some sort. So, I have this one done. I can either put them in the block as I go, or I can put all the rings on. Typically I'll just stick on all the rings on, because then when I get to putting them in, the piston's in, I'll be oiling up the skirts, and then my hand gets all messy, and I just might as well just do all the messy stuff at once. So this will be number 1. I can line it up on the bench, and then I'll just come down the row, and then I can put, set up the pistons so that I can know which one's which as I grab it. Now for putting the pistons and the rings in, it helps to have the block deck vertical so that when we slide them in through the ring compressor, we can just set it in place and gravity will help us hold it there. This way it works quite well. It can also be done where I could put in the side that's horizontal, and then I have access here to help guide the rods and stuff as they come in. Either way works. It all depends on your preference about what you're doing at the time. One thing to make sure that you got the correct piston rings for your piston, and I would check this when you first take them out of the box, which I did quite a while ago, is you want to push the piston ring all the way into the groove and make sure that it's not protruding at all. If it's sticking out, that automatically means that it doesn't have enough radial room, and it'll gouge into the cylinder wall, or you'll never be able to get it in the block in the first place. So that's just a quick and easy check there, as well as making sure they fit the grooves correctly. Since this is a aftermarket Manley rod, we don't have to worry about using bolt boots to keep from gouging the crank, because that is a real possibility, especially on stock rods. I already got the bearings in them from when I measured them. I did not remove them from the rods because I measured the clearances with it in the rod. I'm going to leave them exactly where they are so I don't run the risk of getting them mixed up. Another thing to look at is most rods and bearings, the tang is there to make sure that it's offset correctly, and how it has cheek clearance here. Cheek I'm referring to is the radius of the crank. And the way that this one's offset, just to verify that it's correct, for my piston valve layout, this one goes in either of the 6 or 8 back here, and that also puts it where it's up against the cheek is going to be on the rearmost side. That matches up with where our extra clearance is, and we know that the rod is assembled correctly to the piston. I have an adjustable ring compressor here. You can get them either in a fixed size or adjustable where they have a split, and then you use a hose clamp to adjust the overall diameter. This one's range is 4250 to 434. I have a 4250 bore, so I just tightened it up all the way. It should be close. If I ended up needing a little bit more because I can't push the ring pack through it, I'll be able to loosen up just a little bit before putting it in the block. To prep the piston, I will be oiling the skirt. Both sides, I'll be running a big bead of oil along through the oil ring, and then I'll put down the oil can, and I'm going to wipe the oil over the entire skirt surface, the faces of the rings, and up into the accumulator grooves as well, just so that I know when I go to put this in the cylinder that it's fully lubed. We're also going to want to be putting some assembly lube and oil on the bearing ahead of time before putting that down on the crank. I'm going to try to be quick about this, just for demonstration purposes here. So I'll put a little bit of oil on the bearing. Just start there, and I can put a light layer on, that way it's not going everywhere. Put a big old squeeze of oil, fill up that ring groove. This is one of those times where, too much is probably still not enough. It's dripping on the floor here, but I got a good coat of oil. Just wipe it around all over the piston. And double check to make get my ring gaps lined up with the piston pin. Orientate the piston correctly. I can come over and I can set it down into the ring compressor. Now before I get too carried away, I'm going to want to rotate the crank until it is at the full drop, or bottom of stroke. That way I have the most room for being able to put that piston in and line it up. I want to get the rings started into the compressor by hand. And if we got to lift it out and just kind of push on the rings until they get started in there, you can move the ring compressor up. You don't want to rush this, you just want everything to move nice and easy. And then once I got that started, now I can, and at this point there you can almost just push it in. The rings do have tension, they will like to pop out, so I typically will use a mallet. I'll use the back or the handle end. You don't want to be using anything hard steel or wood that can possibly damage the top of the piston, so that's why you want to use something that's plastic or soft. They also make a piston installing tool, which is just the same thing. It's just kind of a mallet, but it's shaped in a different way. Now we want to work it down, but when we get close to the deck, there's a chamfer at the top of the deck, and the rings are going to want to spring out. So we kind of want to pop the piston through fairly quickly, just light, steady taps. And just like that, the piston's in. Now, because I have the crank down all the way, I can double check that I put the piston, look at the valve pockets, check the chamfer, and now I can just lightly tap and guide this down onto the crankshaft. Soft taps when you get close, because it will need to line it up. There, hear that little bit of a click. That's how I know I got home. Take the bottom half of the bearing and rod. Same thing, we're going to put some lube on it. And get it started, making sure that you put it on the correct way. Now this one has dowel pins, so it's able to hold it in place a little bit. Now before I go tightening it up, I'll make sure I get the bolts lubed up, and with whether they're using ARP lube or just oil, whatever you set your bearing clearances with, torquing them, that's what you use before you put them in. Now the Manley rods, they recommend 90 foot-pounds with 30 weight oil. This is just leftover oil I got. May not be exactly 30 weight, but it's close enough. A little mix of everything in there. So we get the threads all fully lubed up, get the underhead areas lubed up, and then we can get them started. This is that point where if I had the block and I was doing the horizontal, it might be a little easier depending on how you want to go about it. Alright, I'm just running them down hand tight till it pulls everything flush. Notice I'm not using power tools. Power tools have no business anywhere near an engine assembly. And now I got the first one in. I could torque it now if I want to. Usually I'll just get everything assembled and then I'll go through all 8 at a time for one torque sequence, front to back. And then I'll go through them a second time front to back to make sure I don't miss any, and just to double check. Alright, I finished installing the rods and pistons. I'm still able to turn the crank by hand just about all until I had all 8 in. They're only snugged up right now, so I'm just going to take them through a torque sequence. I'm going to go through the whole works. We're going to have to do it in probably 2 steps. And it'll just work front to back, and then we'll do front to back again just to verify, and then we'll see how much foot-pounds it takes to actually rotate the whole assembly. Alright, it's everything at full torque, so we'll go through them one more time just to verify. I typically like to set up my engines on the loose side. Part of that is because Oldsmobile's got some pretty big journals on everything, and it's a lot of rotating weight. So a little more clearance on the mains and the rods helps with that. The other thing is that by freeing up the clearances, by running them a little bit on the loose side there, you can actually reduce, why we're checking the foot-pounds to crank it over, is you're reducing the amount of power needed just to rotate the engine. Now I do have a little bit of reduced drag because of the 1/16, 1/16, 3/16 oil ring pack over the what would have been like a stock 5/64. And we'll see what we ended up with. Here I got the torque wrench set at 25 pounds. We'll see if it even registers. Typically a lot of the engines I'll do, regardless of cubic inch, will be under 40 foot-pounds to rotate. And look at that. Turns not even 25 foot-pounds to get it to rotate. That's the lowest setting this torque wrench has, so it's good. It means it's nice and freed up. Big part of that is, like I said, the clearances. We're also got light oil on there, and a sticky assembly lube would be adding a few foot-pounds of drag as well. But I mean, my rods are around 2.5 thousandths of clearance, and the mains are all at just about 4 thou on average, which, it's a little bit loose. I mean, I like to see 3.5 and 2.5 would have been perfect as far as for what I was shooting for, but there ain't a lot of bearing options for the Oldsmobile, so you kind of got to take what you can get. But I've run big blocks, which has the same 3-inch crank, as loose as 5 thou before on the mains, and connecting rods as loose as like 3/2, but that'd be on a big block. These are small block mains, or sorry, small block rod sizes, so I don't want to have up around 3. That's why my target was 2.5. I think that averages out around 2.6, 2.7. And that's not a problem, because my plan all along has been to run a 2050 in this. That heavy weight oil needs a larger clearance to be able to cycle through properly. What oil you're running an engine should be picked based on the clearances that are in that engine. Especially when you're doing something performance aftermarket. If you try to put 2050 in something that has 1.5 thou on the rods and 2 thou on the mains, you're going to cook the oil right out of it, because the oil just can't escape. That needs to have like a 520 to be able to cycle through well enough, or even 540 if you need the strength adhesion of the oil, but you need that 5 so that it flows. In this case, because we have such wide clearances, it's not a problem that we're running a 2050, and we want those wider clearances to free up horsepower. Now, another good thing to check here is that your rod side clearance. I mean, I got wiggle room on all of these. If the crank was ground properly, I can stick a feeler gauge in here, and I know they're going to be 16 thou. And that's already been checked. Checks out good. So It's just a matter of, now we got the short block together, we need to worry about the timing chain. I gotta figure out what timing cover I'm gonna have to use, whether I gotta use the diesel one or a gas timing cover, and cam thrust surface, stuff like that. But this is what we got as far as the short block assembly. I will have to make a block off plate for the rear main cap, since it is dry sump. We'll be pulling the oil from the pan and won't be needing that, so it'll be good just to plug that hole.